Welcome to the Humanists UK Darwin Day Lecture. Humanists UK has hosted a Darwin Day Lecture now every year since 2003, and in that time it's grown from a small occasion just about filling a community hall to something very special indeed. Former speakers have included Richard Dawkins, Eugenie Scott, Adam Rutherford and Alice Roberts, who now chairs the lecture series and to whom I'll be handing over in just a moment. I'm delighted to say that this evening we have around 3,000 people joining us here tonight, making this the largest ever Darwin Day Lecture. In fact, tonight is the largest gathering of humanists organised by Humanists UK since our 2010 march to protest the Pope's state visit. And the 3,000 in attendance today are not just from the UK either. We're joined by people from almost every country in Western Europe and from Canada, the United States, Brazil, Argentina, Liberia, Australia and India. As such, tonight is a great opportunity to make ourselves seen. So if you have Twitter, please do tweet along on the hashtags #DarwinDayLecture and #DarwinDay. Before I hand over to Alice, I want to slightly abuse my power as the introducer this evening to remind you all that this year, if you're in England and Wales, is census year. 2021 is the first national census since 2011. And just to remind you that if you're not religious, you don't have religious beliefs or religious identity, tick the no religion box. You'll be seeing our posters very much like those that went up with our popular campaign a decade ago very soon. But remember yourself and tell your friends, tick no religion in the census. With that brief commercial break out of the way, I'll now introduce our chair for the evening, our president, Professor Alice Roberts. Alice is known to you all, of course. She's been president of Humanists UK since January 2019. She's Professor of Public Engagement in Science at the University of Birmingham, Director of Anatomy for the NHS Seven School of Surgery, and has honorary fellowships in many other universities. Most importantly, of course, she is our president and she's the chair of the Darwin Day Lecture. I'll let her get on with it now.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Like everything else at the moment, this is a remote event, but actually it's meant that we could welcome even more of you than we'd have been able to before. And I'm so delighted that we've got, we think, well over 3,000 people. So you are amongst very good, wide company tonight. Thank you for joining us. It is the biggest Darwin Day Lecture we've ever had. Now, the Darwin Day Lecture and Medal are named and held to mark the birthday of Charles Darwin on the 12th of February. So we're on precisely the right day tonight. The lectures aim to explore humanism and humanist thought in a scientific evolutionary context. And the Darwin Day speaker and medalist will have made a significant contribution in one of these fields. Former speakers have included Richard Dawkins, Eugenie Scott, Adam Rutherford, and me. And now I have the fantastic job of chairing this lecture series. And tonight it gives me inordinate pleasure to announce the Darwin Day Lecturer 2021, Dr. Oliver Scott Curry. Dr. Oliver Scott Curry is a research director for Kind Lab at kindness.org. He's also a research affiliate at the School of Anthropology and Museum Ethnography at the University of Oxford. And he's a research associate at the Centre for Philosophy of Natural and Social Science at the LSE. His academic research focuses on the nature, content and structure of human morality. So he's interested in questions such as, what is morality? How did morality evolve? What psychological mechanisms underpin moral judgments? How are moral values best measured? And how does morality vary across different cultures? His approach to these questions reaches across several different disciplines. So he uses techniques from different fields, from philosophy, experimental and social psychology, and comparative anthropology as well. Based on this research, he's argued that morality is best understood as a collection of biological and cultural solutions to the problems of cooperation and conflict recurrent in human social life. We are social animals after all. And he's going to explore some of that work and the evidence for his ideas now in the Darwin Day Lecture. Over to you, Oliver.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction, Alice, and thank you all for coming to this lecture this evening. As you heard, my name's Oliver Scott Curry, and I'm interested in morality, in what it is, where it comes from, how it works, what it's for, how it varies, and ultimately what it means to be good. How ought we live? What does it mean to live a moral life? And as you'll know, for centuries, these questions have been studied purely by philosophers and theologians. And for that reason, we haven't made very much progress, and the nature of morality remains shrouded in mystery. But the good news is that we now have a thriving science of morality, a science that draws on genetics and evolutionary biology and animal behavior and psychology and neuroscience and anthropology and all the rest. That is finally answering these deep questions about morality, all the way through and up to the question of how we ought to live. This science tells us there's nothing mysterious or magical about morality. Morality is merely a collection of cooperative rules that help us get along, work together, keep the peace, and promote the common good. The science of morality. Darwin deserves a lot of the credit for kickstarting this new science of morality. He argued that morality should be studied like any other branch of natural history. And that's exactly what he did in his book, The Descent of Man, in 1871. In that book, he argued that humans were social animals. There's no evidence there'd ever been anything other than social animals. He said that humans had a range of innate social feelings. And he very clearly said that what we call moral feelings, our moral instincts, is just another name for these social feelings or these social instincts. He said the moral sense is fundamentally identical with the social instincts. And he went on to speculate about what those social instincts might be. They include, he said, parental affection, sympathy, fidelity, courage, obedience, and so on. And what I'd like to do in my time this evening is just to kind of give this view an update, bring it up to date in line with the latest and best work in moral psychology, work which basically shows that Darwin was right. So and I call this view morality as cooperation. And the gist of it is that we should think of morality as a collection of solutions to recurrent problems of cooperation in human social life. So we now know, as Darwin speculated, that humans are indeed social animals. Humans and their ancestors have lived in social groups for the past 50 million years. And during that time, they've faced a range of problems or opportunities for cooperation, for mutually beneficial social interaction. And over this time, that humans have evolved and more recently invented a range of different solutions to those problems, ways of unlocking the benefits of cooperation. These solutions come in different shapes and sizes. Some are instincts, some are intuitions, some are cultural inventions, some are institutions and norms and laws and so on. But together, these cooperative mechanisms motivate our cooperative behavior, and they provide the criteria by which we evaluate the behavior of others. And it's these solutions in various different forms that philosophers and others have called moral. It's these traits, these character traits, these dispositions, these rules of thumb, these strategies, these are what constitute morality. This is what morality is made of. So far, so Darwin's pretty much in line with what Darwin was arguing all those years ago, but it gets better because we now know there's not just one type of cooperation, there's many different types which explain many different types of morality. So it used to be the case that evolutionists had a hard time explaining why natural selection would ever favor niceness. Surely evolution is a nasty competitive process, and it could only generate nasty competitive individuals. We now know that's not the case. Yes, genes are selfish, but the selfishness here just means self-promoting or self-replicating. And the bottom line is there's different ways of making a living. So sure, genes can replicate themselves at the expense of other genes in other individuals in competitive interactions, but genes can also replicate themselves in concert with other genes in other individuals. They can pursue cooperative strategies. In game theory, those competitive interactions are called zero-sum because one player's gain is another's loss and they add up to zero. But game theory calls those cooperative interactions non-zero-sum because they are win-win situations in which everyone can come out ahead. And game theory also tells us there's not one, but there's many different types of non-zero-sum interactions, many different problems and many different cooperative solutions. Now, I'm not going to test you on this next bit. I just want to show you that I've done my homework. So, for example, there's at least 7 well-established types of cooperation in the literature. Very briefly, the theory of kin selection explains why organisms like us love and care for our families, why we're motivated to protect and provide for them. Mutualism explains why we form groups. There's often strength and safety in numbers, and explains why we value unity, loyalty, solidarity, why being a member of the group is so important to us. And being expelled is social death. The theory of social exchange or reciprocal altruism explains why we do other people favors, why we feel obliged to return favors done for us, why we feel gratitude when we receive a favor and guilt if we can't return it, and why we feel motivated to punish people that don't keep up their end of the deal when it's their turn. And various theories of conflict resolution explain why, instead of coming to blows, we compete for status and resources by showing off our prowess, our formidability, our status, through things like heroic acts of bravery or magnanimous displays of generosity. It also explains why we defer to the winners of those contests, why we respect the winners. And other theories of conflict resolution explain why, when it comes to divisible resources, we divide them up, we share them fairly rather than trying to hog the whole amount. And conflict resolution also explains why we respect prior possession of resources. In other words, why we respect other people's property and refrain from stealing. So there's many different types of cooperation, and in each case, we have very good evolutionary game theory that could explain how these types of cooperation could emerge and evolve. In most cases, we have examples of other animals cooperating in these various ways, from bees to buffaloes to bonobos, but you get the idea. We also have plenty of examples of humans behaving in these ways. Humans form families, form groups, trade favors, resolve conflicts, form status hierarchies, and all the rest. And the crucial bit is that we also find examples of philosophers and others celebrating each and every aspect of these cooperative traits as some important part of what it means to be moral, some important element of morality. Whether that's Confucius talking about the familial obligations, the duty of sons to fathers and fathers to sons, whether it's Royce espousing the philosophy of loyalty, whether that's social contract theorists like Hobbes emphasizing the importance of reciprocity, whether that's classical or Christian thinkers emphasizing the hawkish and dovish virtues of heroism and humility, respectively, whether it's John Rawls singing the praises of fairness or John Locke defending property rights. What often happens is that lots of the literature in moral philosophy involves these different people arguing about which is the best part. But if you take this broad perspective looking at cooperation in the round, you don't have to choose, you can have them all. So that's the technical version. Here's a slightly easier version. The point is that each of these types of cooperation is extremely valuable, immensely valuable. Hence, we value it immensely. And it's these values that we call moral values. So evolutionary approaches, evolutionary game theory has no problem explaining why humans have a moral sense that makes them feel like they ought to pursue and promote these different types of cooperation. Why people feel they ought to, or they feel it's morally right to love their family, to help their groups, to return favors, to be brave, to respect superiors, to be fair, and respect others' property. Now, I've said that this is a scientific account of morality, and it's scientific in one sense because it makes use of nothing more than well-established aspects of the natural and social sciences to explain how we got here, as it were. It's also scientific because it makes testable predictions about morality, about how we expect it to behave in the world, what we expect it to do, what we expect it to contain. For example, the theory that morality is a collection of cooperative rules, partly rooted in our biology, predicts that there will be genes for morality, and in particular, genes for these 7 different types of morality. It predicts that these types of morality will be innate, or at least emerging spontaneously and early during child development. And it predicts that these moral rules will be found all around the world. There'll be cultural universals. I want to give you a whistle-stop tour of some research which lends support to these predictions. So let's start with genes. So are there genes for morality? Even if we accept the idea that morality is a collection of cooperative rules, cooperative traits, it's an open question how these rules are implemented in our brains. And there's many options. So one possibility is that we have many, as it were, special purpose, hardwired moral modules, moral instincts, a moral instinct for each one of these different types of cooperation, each underpinned by its own set of genes. An alternative view, kind of at the other end of the spectrum, is that no, we have one sort of general purpose mechanism, perhaps a general purpose learning mechanism that enables us to pick up these rules from our social environments, from our experience, from our culture. In order to investigate this question and make some progress on it, my colleagues and I did two things. We developed a new moral values questionnaire that asked people how much they endorsed these 7 different types of morality. And we administered it to 2,000 plus twins in Australia, identical and non-identical twins. Now, identical and non-identical twins share all and half of their genes respectively. And what this enables us to do is to work out to what extent the differences between people are due to differences in their genes. But also it enables us to work out whether different aspects of our morality are influenced by different genes. So if there were multiple different mechanisms for multiple different types of morality, we'd expect there to be lots of different sets of genes, one for each of the 7 types, as it were. Whereas if there's just one big mechanism, we'd expect one set of genes. So, well, what did we find? Well, on the one hand, we found, and again, I'm not expecting you to take notes on these numbers. I just want you to see that I've done my homework. So on the one hand, we found evidence for a general mechanism, a general moral factor. So a set of genes that influences all of our moral judgments. And here, the boxes here are different questions on the questionnaire, grouped into family, group, reciprocity, heroism, deference, fairness, and property. So there does seem to be a general mechanism that influences judgments across the board. However, we also found evidence at the same time for distinct sets of genes influencing distinct types of morality. So what this means is that morality is not the product of just one general purpose mechanism. It's a kind of hybrid system. Yes, there's a general factor, but there's also these multiple mechanisms influencing our judgments too, each one being influenced by a different set of genes. Or to put it another way, genes that influence how important you think bravery is are different from the genes that influence how important you think fairness is. So different genes are responsible for influencing different moral values. And I can't see any of your faces out there, but I hope you're as giddy with excitement as I am about those results. Now, at the moment, we don't know which genes are responsible for these effects. We don't know the names of the genes or exactly where they're located, but it's only a matter of time. In principle, we could, and perhaps it's only a matter of time until we find out. All we need is a much bigger sample, and we're off to the races. And that's certainly on our to-do list. Okay, let's switch gears somewhat and think about what these genes might be doing. Now, can you spot the good baby and the bad baby? So let's talk about babies for a minute, about infant development. So there's been a long-running debate in developmental psychology about whether babies are born, whether they're born good or whether they're born bad. Does morality come naturally to them, or is this something that babies have to learn? The standard view for up until recently has been that babies are more or less blank slates, and they have to learn the difference between right and wrong by being taught it explicitly by their parents. But a series of amazing experiments in child development in infant cognition has changed all that in the last few years, the last decade or so. Generally speaking, what happens in these experiments, just to give you an overview, in order to find out what babies know and when they know it, and in particular, when different moral capacities come online, experimenters often use vignettes involving puppets. And they get the puppets to break the rules in some way, and then they look to see whether the infants in the studies notice or care about these puppets breaking the rules. So here's an example from an experiment on fairness, conducted not by me, but by a team in, I think, in North America. So in this study, as you'll see in this experiment, the basic setup is that kids see, the children in the experiment see one or other of these scenes played out in front of them as represented in these comic strips. So in both cases, there's two puppets, and an experimenter turns up with two cookies. But in the equal condition, the experimenter gives one cookie to each puppet. And in the unequal condition, the experimenter gives two cookies to one puppet. So there's a kind of a fair and unfair condition. And for those of you sitting at the back, there's I've zoomed in just the last picture there. So what the experimenters found in this and similar experiments is that babies notice and pay attention to and spend a lot longer looking at the unequal condition, the condition in which one of the poor, I guess they're penguins, one of the penguins doesn't get a cookie. They're alarmed and they're surprised, and they perk up and they pay attention. Interestingly, they don't pay attention if the puppets are removed in a kind of non-social condition where the experimenter is just placing two cookies on two plates, or two different plates, or two cookies on one plate. So it's only when there's, as it were, an agent there that they realize something is amiss, and the babies respond accordingly. So even at this young age, infants are showing the first signs, the first inklings of a sense of fairness. At what age, you ask? Well, in this study, they were 4 months old. 4 months old. And similar studies have shown similar things in these other moral domains. So some experiments have shown showing that different types of morality seem to come online at different points. So after these first signs of fairness, next kids as young as less than 12 months, experiments show that they expect little puppets to defer to big puppets. Next, they're surprised if individuals on the group condition, they're surprised if individuals fail to help members of their team. Next up, they start respecting property at 4 years. They recognize when other individuals possess things and it's not appropriate to take things from them. A little bit after that, at 5 years, they're surprised if individuals don't help members of their family. And finally, the kids start reciprocating. Now, none of these experiments by themselves prove that these moral traits are innate, but the earlier they emerge, the more difficult it becomes to explain them as the result of learning. And of course, the theory that they're innate is consistent with the genetic evidence that I presented earlier. Okay. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, well, this all sounds very good, Oliver, but surely this is just a Western view of morality. Is it really the case, as your theory predicts, that people all around the world would agree with these 7 moral rules? Or is it the case that different people in different places have radically different understandings of what it means to be good? Now, again, people have been arguing about this for centuries. Here's David Hume and John Locke going at it in the Enlightenment, taking diametrically opposed views. Hume argued that there were a variety of moral traits that were universal principles of morals, esteemed universally all around the world in all nations and all ages, and he thought they were part of human nature. At the other end of the spectrum, you had John Locke arguing, no, there's no, what he's saying here is he says there's nothing that's morally good in one culture that is not somewhere else considered morally bad. So he's expressing a very sort of radical moral relativist view that for any given trait, you can find an example of it being the opposite. And this debate rolls on to today. There's still people arguing it this one way or another, largely because they don't have the evidence to decide it either way until now. So in order to try and make some move things on and try and make some progress on this question and answer it once and for all, my colleagues and I at the University of Oxford, we went to the archives. We analysed over 600 accounts of ethics from 60 cultures around the world, comprising over half a million words describing ethics in all these different places, looking to see whether people in these different places thought that these 7 types of cooperation were morally good or not. Whether they thought that loving your family, helping your group, returning favors, being brave, deferring to superiors, being fair, respecting others' property were good things to do or not. And what did we find? Well, this is what we were looking for. So we have the 7 moral rules down one side, and here's the 60 societies along the top. The short answer, and each of the subsequent dots shows a hit in that particular culture. So what did we find? Well, the short answer is we found examples of these moral rules all over the place. In a bit more detail, we found examples of most of these rules in most places. And importantly, there were no counterexamples. There were no societies in which any of these types of cooperation was considered morally bad. And we also observed these morals, or these hits occurred with sort of equal frequency across continents. So it wasn't the case that these just cropped up in the West or the East or the North or the South. They cropped up all around the world. So for example, the Amhara, in Amhara adolescence, they emphasized the importance of loyalty to kin. In Korea, there was an egalitarian community ethic of in-group solidarity. Among the Garo, reciprocity is very high up in their structure of values, and so on around the world. So basically, Hume was right and Locke was wrong. There are indeed some universal moral values. There's some traits that are considered moral all around the world without exception, without anyone thinking that they are morally bad. Now, I should add at this point that it's not a prediction of the theory, and nor have we found, or was it our impression, that morals were identical around the world, identical in different cultures. On the contrary, the theory predicts that moral values will reflect the value of cooperation under different conditions. So, for example, if you live in a society, if you live in a traditional society surrounded by your extended family, and most of the benefits of life flow to you through your kin network, then family values are going to loom relatively large in your system of ethics, compared to people who, for example, live in a modern society where a larger proportion of their interactions are with strangers, and where, for example, reciprocity and fairness loom larger. So we weren't able to test this theory when we were combing through all the ethnographies, but we're now using the moral values questionnaire to gather new data from 40 cultures around the world to put this theory to the test. And generally, the take-home message is that in this study, this ethnographic study, it shows that these 7 morals are not just Western inventions. Instead, they seem to form part of a common core of universal moral principles. Morality is always and everywhere a cooperative phenomenon, and everyone everywhere agrees that cooperating in all these various ways is the right thing to do. In the home straight now. So finally, so I've argued that morality is all about cooperation, that we have a collection of cooperative moral traits, and I've given some evidence that there are genes for morality, that they emerge early and are probably innate, and you find them all over the world. If this view of morality is correct, and if morality is just another part of the natural world, another part of our psychology, and whether that theory is correct is an empirical question, what implications does this have for how we ought to behave, what we ought to do, what's morally good to do? Now, many scientists will say none at all, because you can't go from facts to values. You can't go from is to ought. But this is wrong. That can't be the case, because these are not any old facts. These are facts about morality. These are facts about the nature and content of our moral values. And moral values are where are what guides our moral decisions. So merely making discoveries about those moral values doesn't suddenly disqualify them from guiding our behavior. So surely these discoveries do have implications for how we ought to behave. And rather than pretending they have none, we should think through what they are. So what are they? Well, I think that if it's true that morality is a collection of cooperative rules, then it follows that acting morally involves acting in accordance with these rules. Simply put, if you want to be moral, then you ought to cooperate. And more specifically, as we've seen, you ought to love your family, be loyal to your group, return favors, be brave, defer to superiors, be fair, respect others' property, and so on. And you shouldn't neglect your family, be disloyal, cheat, be a coward, be disrespectful, be unfair, or steal. And if so you should pursue these moral values. And if these moral values come into conflict, as they will, if you have to choose between different cooperative opportunities, if you have to choose between, for example, helping your family or helping your group, then you should choose the more cooperative option. You should choose the greater good. Now, this approach doesn't give an instant answer to all of your moral dilemmas, but it does at least clarify the question. This approach says that when you're making a moral decision, in effect, what you're asking is, what is the cooperative move to make in this situation? And when you're making a moral judgment, you're saying, did this other person make the cooperative move, or would they make the cooperative move? And by bringing this process out into the open and making it possible to sort of scrutinize in the cold light of day, science makes it easier for us to see our way to the right answer. And I should emphasize that we don't have to stick with the cooperative strategies given to us by nature. Our moral instincts are good. They've stood the test of time, but there's no guarantee that they're optimal. We can and should, and indeed have, over the course of history, invented new and improved cooperative solutions to our problems. And that's what moral progress looks like. Okay, I've argued that morality is all about cooperation. There's many types of cooperation which explain many types of morality. These types of morality are evolutionarily ancient, genetically and psychologically distinct, early emerging, and apparently cross-culturally universal. And I've argued that if you want to be moral, then you ought to cooperate. By demystifying morality, Darwin did us a great favor by making it easier for all of us to do the right thing. So thank you, Charles, and thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much, Oliver. That was fantastic. Reducing morality down to its kind of natural basis, and I say reducing, it doesn't diminish it in any way. I think it improves it. I think it gives it much stronger foundations. And some of what you were talking about, especially on the more biological points, reminded me of the amazing biologist Lynn Margulis and her work on symbiosis in biology, and that the way that we very often have that misrepresentation, I think, of Darwin's theories in particular, but evolutionary biology generally, where we focus on that kind of nature red in tooth and claw and the competition, and we don't look so much at the cooperation. Do you see that as being a theme in biology, that we really have stressed the competition too much?
Well, I think we've I think people seem to swing one way or the other. So some people overemphasize the competition side, and other people have sort of rose-tinted glasses and think everything in the garden is lovely. We don't have to choose one or the other. As I said, there's different ways of making a living, and nature has found both of them. We're fortunate to be in a species that is, obviously by no means perfect, but relatively cooperative compared to most, if not all, other species. And as a result, human nature is a mixture of the good and the bad.
Yeah, I think it's quite. It really strikes you when you look at deep human evolution that that capacity for cooperation is a unique human ability. I mean, we tend to think about individual abilities and individual anatomical adaptations, so things like the large brain and walking around on two legs. But actually, cooperation is probably the most important survival tool that we've come up with.
Yeah, I think it's an amazing way of generating benefits that weren't there before. So, I mean, one way to think about the non-zero sumness is that by working together, people and organisms in general are extracting from the world value that wasn't there before. They're creating value and enjoying its benefits. So yeah, it's enormously beneficial, and it explains why humans have been, to the extent they have been, they've been the success they have.
Now, some of the questions coming in tonight, we will get round to these questions from our lovely audience in a second, but some of them do bring up this idea that seems to rumble on, that it's slightly controversial still to suggest that morals are natural and intrinsic to humans, that that they emerge out of our natural biology without needing anything supernatural or any kind of divine guidance to be there. Why do you think that is still controversial? Because that controversy is still there.
I don't know. I mean, maybe it just takes a long time for people to catch up. I mean, it used to be the case that people thought that the gods were responsible for the weather, but when we stopped believing that, the weather was still there and we still get rained on and all the rest of it. And it's basically the same with morality. For a long time, there's been, as it were, a creationist theory of morality that somehow it popped into existence by magic. We now have new and better theories that do a better job of explaining what morality is and how it works. And hopefully in due course, the creationist theory of morality will recede.
Thank you. Well, we've got lots and lots of questions that have come in. I'm going to start with Ross Groves, who was very quick off the mark. How has the change to a more secular society affected our morality in relation to death? And how is this changing the relationship with death? How is this changing relationship with death affected our response to the pandemic? That's a really interesting question. Do you have a perspective on that, Oliver?
Not off the top of my head, no. I'm afraid I haven't worked on that particular question. Attitudes to death. I think we probably still think it's a bad thing. But one interesting segue is that sometimes when I give this talk and talk about the universal moral rules, I get people to guess what they are. And the first thing that most people say most of the time is, thou shalt not kill, you shouldn't kill, killing is bad. And interestingly, that isn't one of the rules. And actually the opposite is the case. There are many situations where it's perfectly acceptable, in fact, morally obligatory to kill, whether that's in self-defense, for example, or in revenge or punishment for particularly serious crime, and so on. So even the who you're allowed to kill under different conditions is explained by these various cooperative strategies. So I know that's not quite answering the questioner's question, but I'll give it some thought.
It is an element of it, though. I mean, it's certainly something that I've thought about in relation to the work that I do, the sort of archaeological work that I do, and the way that attitudes to death have changed over time. And we can see those in relation to funerary practice. And of course, what we've had in Britain over the 20th century is a big shift from burial to cremation. And that's interesting, because I think that the attitudes to burial and cremation are almost completely separate from any religion. Although we've had increasing secularization over the 20th century, I don't really think that is the driver. And so we seem to be seeing a move to perhaps less fixation on the body, less fixation on the dead body, and more contemplation about the life that has passed. I don't know, but we are facing death in so many ways. Many of us will have experienced losing loved ones over the last year to COVID or not, and I think that not being able to run funerals in the way that we would normally, and I know that, you know, Humanists UK has been working really closely with all of our amazing teams of celebrants to deal with that and to make sure that people have the opportunity to still engage with that ritual, even though it's not in the usual setting. It's a really interesting question. Goodness me, we could talk for hours on that. I'm going to move on. But there are lots of questions though, so I better move on to the next one. Let's move on to William Costello. How should we find the right balance between moral relativism and cultural superiority arguments? Do you believe, like Sam Harris, that science can help us map an objective moral landscape? Interesting question, Oliver.
Well, yeah, I mean, yes and no. So as we have seen, people all around the world think that cooperating is the right thing to do, but different people in different places face different problems, different, as it were, portfolios of problems, and their moral systems reflect that. So even though everyone's at one abstract level, everyone's trying to do the same thing, they're trying to do the same thing in different circumstances. So it should be possible to make moral judgments of different cultures, but not by just, as it were, implanting your preferred solutions to their problems or vice versa. You have to put yourself in their shoes and understand the problems that they are facing. Now, you still might conclude that they're doing it wrong, or they could be doing something better. But the first step is understanding where they're coming from, understanding the world that they're living in, and vice versa.
So it sounds like you're saying that yes, science can help, but it's not going to rank moral systems for us. No. I mean, it's like science can explain why different animals have different features because they are in different environments. It doesn't mean that one animal, there's some kind of ranking system where, I don't know, pigeons are superior to badgers or something. They're different sets of tools for different circumstances, and it's the same with different moral systems in different cultures. Thank you very much for that question, William. Andrew says, are conditions such as psychopathy and sociopathy products of the human brain because our brains have morality? Do animals display morality? And consequently, do these negative conditions show up in the animal kingdom?
That's interesting. So, yeah, like all traits, niceness is normally distributed. At the one end you have, for want of a secular word, you have saints, and at the other end you have sinners or psychopaths, and usually most of us are somewhere in the middle. There's some debate about what psychopathy is. I mean, the kind of the movie version of a kind of evil genius, it doesn't seem to be true. It's a bit of a fiction. Some people have argued that psychopaths are a sort of niche strategy, that if you have a large population of cooperators, then there's a niche for a sort of predatory individuals to take advantage of them. That's one possibility, but the more likely possibility, I think, is that psychopaths are it's just a pathology. It's just things have gone wrong. We have a sophisticated social psychology. There's lots of ways for it to go wrong, and what we call psychopathy or sociopathy is kind of what happens when there's a big spanner in the works. In terms of other animals, then sure, it's certainly the case that other animals cooperate in all of these various ways. Bees give up their lives for their other members of the hive. Lots of animals care for their offspring. Lots of animals engage in collective defense or collaborative hunting. A few animals, not many, seem to exchange favors, and loads of animals form status hierarchies and show off rather than coming to blows. So yeah, to the extent there's lots of animals that do this that, as it were, cooperate in these simple ways, perhaps not as sophisticated as the way we do it. It's something of a semantic question if you want to call that morality or not. I don't mind. But yeah, in terms of whether there's sort of psychopathic animals at that end of the spectrum, I don't know. That's a good question. I'm sure if you go on YouTube, not now, afterwards, there are lots of videos of monkeys and apes playing a version of this kind of game. So I think the most famous one is by Sarah Brosnan and Frans de Waal, where the experimenters give, in one condition, they give both, there's two, I think they're marmosets, give two marmosets a grape each. In another condition, they give one a grape and one a cucumber. And the one that gets the cucumber goes, I was about to say ape something, but it goes completely crazy and is furious that it's been treated so badly relative to this other one. So there's certainly some very dramatic demonstrations of what looked like a sense of fairness in other primates. I'm not up to date with the latest thinking about that study. I know there was some criticisms of it, and people thought people doubted that it showed what it's supposed to show. I think there's been a whole bunch of further experiments doing it in different ways with other primates. Sarah Brosnan has a good, relatively recent review of all that. So there's certainly some evidence for a sense of fairness in other primates. Yes.
It's always very tricky, isn't it, with other animals, because you can't ask them, and you can kind of see what they're doing and monitor their behavior, and then you can compare it with behavior in humans, and you always have to be careful about anthropomorphism. But on the other hand, I think that there's been a real cautious approach to looking at other animals with all sorts of aspects of behavior and saying actually that is equivalent to what's happening in humans. I mean, particularly with things like play, where you say, well, it's something that's pretty universal to all mammals, actually, and that they're all engaging in this form of behaviour, and that it is really about the same thing. And also laughing. I mean, the fact that other mammals laugh, that you can tickle a rat and it laughs, and it seems that you'd have to be very obtuse to say that's not really laughing.
Yeah, and you can also go too far the other direction. I mean, if it looks like a duck and walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. So if you see animals cooperating in these various ways, and if you see especially mammals cooperating in these ways, it's not unreasonable to hypothesize that they have some similar social motivations.
We've got Jonathan Isles. You tested 2,000 Australian twins. Did you account for how weird they were? Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic?
Yeah, well, we didn't account for it, but because it's just one sample, but sure, that is a limitation of the study. And in an ideal world, we'd test twins all around the world, funding permitting.
You want more twins?
Yes, please.
Yeah, he's advertising tonight for more twins. Tom Toledo Brown, how does the moral value of division fairness fit with heroism and deference? If there's a hierarchy, who's to judge what's fair? Tricky.
If there's a, I mean, yeah, who's to judge what's fair? Well, fairness is sort of the point is that those different types of cooperation in principle can sort of occur independently. So fairness can occur whenever people are in dispute over some resource. So if Alice and I are neighbors and we're disputing, the boundary of our territory, we might agree to save everyone a lot of pain just to draw a line down the middle, just to split the difference, to meet in the middle. So that would be a fair outcome. We've divided the disputed resource to our mutual benefit, or avoiding a mutual cost. Certainly the deeper, so often that process results in equal shares, but if there are power differentials between the players, sometimes that can result in unequal shares, but still a sort of stable outcome is better than continued chaos. But it will be the case that precisely because these moral values are somewhat independent, they can and will come into conflict. So if you like, what this approach suggests is that moral life is going to consist of not just choosing whether to cooperate or not in these different ways, but also to choose between these different cooperative opportunities. So, moral dilemma, we can predict a whole range of moral dilemmas that people will likely face, when family comes into conflict with group, or when being fair comes into conflict with deference, for example. There's a nice paper on whistleblowing in the workplace, which is like that. So should you defer to your boss's wishes? Should you do what your boss says? Or should you report him for, I don't know, taking the stationery home, or fiddling his expenses or something? So that's what moral life consists of, these trying to jostle these different competing obligations.
Yeah, that did strike me when you were talking about those different aspects of morals in your lecture, and you mentioned in-group loyalty, having just been talking today about vaccines and equitable distribution of vaccines, where we're just seeing an extreme version of in-group loyalty in the way that we are piling up vaccines in the UK and various other countries. And whereas, we know that other countries are not getting anywhere near the same resources. And there are altruistic and non-altruistic reasons for wanting to make that much more equitable.
Yeah, yes, and certainly you can also, along those lines, you can also have too much of a good thing. So if you think about those, the graphic equalizer, if each of those are our moral principles, it's certainly possible to under cooperate and perhaps over cooperate and be a sucker. And I like sometimes think of sort of fanatics or extremists are people who have turned one of those dials up to 11 at the expense of all the others. So they pursue, one or other, like, the self-flagellating monks have pursued humility and deference up to 11 at the expense of all the other things. So it's certainly possible to have, to kind of overdo it and pursue one type of cooperation to the detriment of all the others.
That's fascinating, because that, I think you would, or I would naively assume that if you could ramp them all up to the top, that would be brilliant. But actually what you're saying is just getting a nice balance. Is you probably end up with better behavior as a whole if you were to do that.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, these, like evolutionary stable, I mean, we're talking about evolutionary stable strategies, and it's not the case that more is better. There's a target, there's a optimal target, especially when you have to make trade-offs.
Right. Much more stuff about the twin studies, which I think I'm just going to have to let people go and look at the original research, which I hope might be available. Is it available through your website, Oliver?
It's the preprint will shortly be available.
Excellent. Excellent. And you'll be tweeting that, won't you? Oliver is on Twitter. You should follow him. So David McKnight says, which discipline will stretch the reach and effectiveness of universal humanism furthest and quickest, science or philosophy? It's a fight. Are we allowed to have fights? We're not allowed to have fights. We're all very moral tonight.
I think I would say science, but certainly when it comes to understanding morality.
Okay, good. I'm glad about that, but also I think that increasingly I see less of a distinction between science and philosophy the further I go, which is, I don't know whether that just comes with age, does it?
I think that when philosophy gets its act together and finally leaves home, it becomes a science, and that happened with the natural sciences in general. It happened with philosophy of mind becoming psychology 100 years ago, and I think we're in a situation now where moral philosophy or ethics is going through the same process. So, when I first started studying morality, philosophy departments were the only place to do it. In the last few decades, that's completely changed. Now there's papers on the genetics of morality, on the neuroscience of morality, appearing on the front pages of the top scientific journals in the world. There's enormous, fantastic cross-cultural work looking at thousands of people in hundreds of cultures. So it's completely changed, it's completely revolutionized, and all for the good, I think.
It is interesting going back to the ancient Greek philosophers, actually, isn't it? And seeing that there's much less distinction there, and that there does seem to be a perception of a kind of continuism, a continuum between science and philosophy. That there's, it's not one way of looking at the world and another way. It's all part of the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's basically. I'm not sure. I've never really understood the difference, in the sense that if philosophy is about thinking clearly, thinking logically, and philosophers don't have a monopoly on thinking clearly. Scientists have to do that too. So if, to the extent that philosophy is about, getting your ideas in order and making sure they're coherent and logically sound, fine. If and when they get to the point where they're making testable predictions about the world, then sort of the same idea is just sort of handed over to be tested. So there's no difference in the content of the idea.
Julianne Corneby says, if morality is rooted in genes, isn't it a cause for despair, telling us bad guys will be bad guys, regardless of any reasoning, convincing or discussing? So, yeah, are you talking about biological determinism, Oliver?
Well, a bit, but so it's certainly the case that genes have a causal effect on you and your thinking, but they're not the only causal effect. Like I said, that your genes are the product of nature and nurture. So I don't think it's ever a problem to discover the causes of things. To quote the LSE's slogan, the more you know about what causes things, the more you can intervene. Now, if it turns out that there are some psychopaths, there are some completely incorrigible bad guys, well, so be it. And certainly that would seem to be an accurate picture of the world. Like I say, most of us do the right thing most of the time, but there's certainly some bad guys around. So if that's what the theory predicts, so be it.
But I suppose I think what Julien is probably getting at is there hope for an individual? And I think that from a kind of biological perspective, I mean, so little about human behaviour is what we could reasonably describe as innate or completely genetically determined. We are creatures of culture. So, the way that we behave is very much a continuous conversation between genes and our cultural environment.
Yes.
So I think we shouldn't think that anybody is lost at birth for that reason. No, I mean, but they might need to work harder.
Yeah, I think it's just like every other trait, people vary, and they vary for a variety of reasons. And the more we understand about those reasons, the more, in principle, we could intervene to shift them along the curve one way or the other.
Right. Dickie Bellringer says, is that really your name? That's a great name if it is. Are you saying that every moral act has its basis in cooperative behaviour, and that every act with its basis in cooperative behaviour is also a moral act? Interesting. Yes, it goes on, but that's basically the crux of it. So are they synonymous?
Yes.
Okay, good.
So,
nice.
That's a good question. And I think it's the case that everything that we call moral, if we've diagnosed it correctly, will turn out to be the product of some cooperative strategy, or perhaps a byproduct of that strategy. I don't entirely know whether everything that's cooperative gets called moral, because I think there's some cooperation that we don't intuitively recognize. There's certainly cooperation, between ourselves, between our intrapersonal cooperation that doesn't register. There might be other type, and there might be modern technologically facilitated cooperation that meets the criteria of being some non-zero sum game, but we can't quite recognize it because we don't have the evolved intuitions to see it. So I think, all morality is cooperative, but I'm not sure whether all cooperation is moral.
Okay, right. Richard Francis, could these discoveries prevent AI robots rising up and destroying humanity, Oliver?
Well, if we want to, yes. So if we want to create moral robots, ethical AI, then one way to do it is to build into them the same moral principles that we use and we recognize and we think are morally good. So yeah, sure. In principle, we could reconstruct these cooperative strategies in silicon rather than in meat, and we could have recognizably moral robots.
Viv says she's interested in situations in which moral codes conflict. For example, the argument that all killing is wrong, just as as against the idea of a just war, where killing is justified to prevent greater evil. What is right, or even going on, as per Oliver's lecture, if he has time to respond? Thank you.
What was the question? What is going on?
What is going on? Yeah, what is going
yeah.
on? So what happens when those different moral codes conflict with each other? When you might feel that something is desperately wrong in one setting, but you would do it in another setting.
Well, what's happening is that the problem you're facing is different. So it's not good to, kill people in front of you in the queue at Tesco's, but it might be good to kill people who are invading your country and about to wipe out everyone you know and care about. So it's obviously, it's horses for courses.
Okay. Carlos Galeno Rios, can you elaborate on how you came up with the claim about genes causing this, specifically how you arrived to the conjecture that there are different genes for different moral traits?
By analogy, think of it like your visual system. So we can see different colors, or I can't see all of them because I'm a bit colorblind, but anyway, I've heard that people can see, that you humans can see different colors, and you might think, how does that work? Before we had any knowledge of how eyes work, do we just have one type of receptor that varied in one dimension, or do we have multiple different receptors that vary in different directions that are responsible for the different colors we see? So it's just it's a logical possibility. I wonder if it's one or the other. We can do some experiments to find out. And similarly, when it comes to morality, these are functionally distinct traits. I mean, the rule return a favor is not the same as the rule respect others' property or be brave. These are sort of conceptually different, and it's just an open question how these different functions are implemented. It's possible that each instinct evolved completely separately and has its own dedicated machinery. Alternatively, we could have one big general purpose learning mechanism, and we learn all these different traits in the same way. And it seems like it's a bit of both.
Question from Adrian Widowson. Aren't loyalty to the group and xenophobia, even racism, two sides of the same coin?
Yes. So it's partly what I was saying before, that it's possible to pursue these traits too far, and at the expense of other traits. So, and obviously we all know historical examples of when that has happened.
No, I think that.
Xenophobia. Yeah, sorry. So yes, it's a modicum of loyalty is fine, but certainly you can have too much of it, and it can result in one group being horrible to another group. But when that happens, it's the same. We're applying the same criteria, just at a bigger scale. So when we're asking whether has this nation behaved morally or immorally or appropriately or not, compared to this other nation or this other group of people, we can ask the same thing. What does it mean for a group to be good or a group to be bad? Well, if one group enters into a cooperative relationships with other groups, if they sign treaties, if there's a peace treaty, if they coordinate their behaviors, if they trade fairly and freely, that's all to the good. Whereas if one group is predatory and attacks and is uncooperative, cheats on another group, then we would say that was bad, morally bad.
This reminds me of Steven Pinker's sort of expanding circles of empathy, or if not, I mean, he says actually you cannot empathize with 9 billion people, and what you need is almost studied indifference, and indifference in a way that you don't treat somebody who you don't know around the other side of the world any better or worse than you treat your neighbor. So that's interesting as well, and that's very sort of thoughtful moralizing, isn't it?
Yes. I think it's I mean, this is a whole nother discussion, but I get the impulse, but I also think it might be a little bit utopian, in the sense of expecting people to treat everyone in the world equally is unlikely and impossible and intractable. That people who take that extreme utilitarianism view, it's almost they they think that the best thing to do is what's best for everyone in our universe, and our moral sentiments fall short. I tend to think of it as the other way around, that our moral sentiments have done a pretty good job so far, sort of building up from the ground. And sure, we should try and build them up as high as possible and get them to go as far as we can to cooperate on an ever bigger scale. But we shouldn't fault them for not being perfect and not pursuing a sort of unstable strategy of universal, indiscriminate altruism.
If moral values are universal and everyone has the same set of the same genes, how can you then find the genes for them? Because all of our, we have, we have lots of the same genes. Some of us have more genes than others, but there's lots of variation within those genes, would be my answer. Oliver?
Yes, that sounds good. If the question was, how do we find them?
Yes, it was. He says if moral values are universal, but I don't know whether that's a bit of a red herring.
It's like the principles seem to be universal, but exactly where people stand on them varies for biological and cultural reasons.
And yes, and genes are no individual is genetically identical to another individual. John, your DNA is absolutely unique. Now, the differences between you and Oliver and me might be tiny. Oh, yeah. But even then, as you grow older, of course, some of your DNA and some of your somatic cells will be mutating. So if you're an adult twin, you will still have differences to the other twin. One. Yeah, because we're all a little bit mutants. Julian Bergini, your 7 types of moral principle are very thin. We can disagree about the details of what they require. Your claim that the right decision is the most cooperative one isn't scientific, Oliver. He's being very harsh here. But, we are open to all sorts of questions. For example, we have to decide who we cooperate with and to what end. We can accept science has a lot to tell about morality, but why insist science is all we need for morality? I don't know if that's what you were doing.
Yeah, pretty much. I wonder, is that the Julian Bergini? Well, like I said, what it looks like is that morality consists in the attempt. Morality is the attempt to cooperate. It's a hypothesis for how to cooperate, and whether we succeed or not, or whether a cooperative strategy, whether a particular behavior succeeds in promoting cooperation or not, is an empirical question. So I don't see what else is there. This is all happening in the natural world. It's just a part of human behavior. It's an attempt to achieve some particular social outcome, and we can succeed or fail. At what point does it suddenly sort of spill over the edge of the table and become non-scientific? I don't see where or if that happens. It obviously doesn't mean we always get the right answer. You never know if you've got the right answer in science in general, but it's no more or less empirical than deciding what's the best food to eat.
I suppose it's about whether you think that it is whether you could approach it rationally and understand it rationally, which is what you're arguing, and whether that therefore means you're talking about it from a scientific perspective. I mean, I don't know if Julian means, I don't know if we're coming back to that kind of philosophy versus science thing again, which we think is probably an unhelpful dichotomy anyway.
Yeah, I think so, in the sense that they're sort of coterminous, is that a word? Or they're continuous. But also in terms of the question, who we should cooperate with, the argument would be as many people as you can. So if the goal is to promote cooperation, and you see an opportunity to kickstart a cooperative scheme that, to promote the common good of a larger group of people, the theory would say that's the thing to go for. So, if you can spot untapped cooperative opportunities, you can be a norm entrepreneur and generate benefits that weren't there before, then you're doing very well, and you'll be hailed as a prophet, as a visionary, as a someone who really shook things up.
Sounds to me like you're coming up with a new definition of how to live a good life. I look forward to the book, Oliver.
Thank you.
somebody says they are an autistic person and often feel a greater sense of fair play and justice. Is there evidence for this as a trait in other autistic people in other cultures?
That's a very good question. I'm pretty sure there is a fair amount of work on moral psychology, moral decision making in people with autism, but I'm afraid I'm not on top of it. So I couldn't answer your question just now.
It's a really interesting question, though, isn't it? Because it brings us back to that point that you were talking about, where we were saying that it's a balance of lots of different types of moralities, I suppose, and approaches to moralities that brings out the best in an individual, but also perhaps in a society as well. That you want that balance across people in a society.
Yeah, sure. I mean, people differ, and some of the differences are random. It's possible that some of the differences are functional, and you need different people to make a good team. Sure, anything's possible.
Anastasia says, given the genetic evidence in particular, are there then likely to be people born with different capacities for the different types of moral cooperation? And would this explain why some people, for example, are more deferential to leaders than others, and some more heroic than others, etc.?
Yes.
Yeah.
So on the basis of this study and well, let's say more generally, what this study and similar studies suggest is that about 10 to, I'm going to make up a number in the middle to make it easy. About 20% of the differences between people when it comes to how kind they are, for example, how moral they are, seem to be due to differences in genes between people. But the remainder, sort of 80% of the differences between people are not due to genes. They're due to some other aspect of the world. Now, it seems that very, very little of the differences between people are due to how they were, their home environment, how they were parented, contrary to many people's expectations. Most of the difference seems to come from what's called the non-shared environment. So everything sort of outside the home, or just random noise. This is one of the things I think is really interesting and untapped at the moment. It looks like most of the differences in our moral values come from some aspect of the environment, we don't know which. So, but rather than just saying, oh, it's nature or it's nurture, now we're in a position to say, okay, which bits of nurture are important? Which bits of the world, we have these different mechanisms. We might expect different ones to be calibrated by different aspects of the social world. And we're not anywhere near sort of exploring all the possibilities. So again, it's another huge opportunity for fascinating research.
Is that an area you want to research, or even that you are researching?
Well, I've got a very long to-do list. It's on there somewhere. Yes.
I'm gonna have to just fit one more question in, because there's so many good questions here. Thank you for all these questions, and I think we might be able to answer some more of them remotely somehow, because it's always a shame when you're inundated with questions. I mean, honestly, Oliver, we could have done a whole day, I think, with these questions. They're great. I'm going to finish with Roger Hutton. How do we reflect on cooperation within an essentially amoral group, such as an organized crime family? Interesting question.
Yeah. The way I would think about it is the difference between local and global cooperation. So people can cooperate in order to do something uncooperative. So the robbers on that band, they might really rely on one another. They might be a really good team. They might be really trustworthy. They might be quite brave. They might be loyal to each other. The whole run of things. But when we're looking at them in the round, when we kind of zoom out and consider their behavior from the perspective of society as a whole, we see that group was being uncooperative, was breaking one of the other principles. And so on balance, we just say, well, yeah, we can understand what's going on in their individual psychologies relating to one another, but in the great scheme of things, they're being uncooperative. And for that reason, we think that what they're doing is morally wrong.
I'm going to squeeze one more question in. Sorry about this, everybody. Irene Richards, given that politics operates generally in a context of confrontation rather than cooperation, could it be said that politics, at least in its current form, is immoral and not for the common good?
Wow, that's a good question to end on. I think this is a very simplified answer. So I think that politics is largely an argument about which cooperative schemes to pursue. So should we spend money on this project over here, or should we spend money on that project over there? Who should we take money from? Who should we give money to? So politics is an argument about how to steer collective action. And to that extent, it's somewhat zero sum. So if we spend money over here, we can't spend it over there. So politics is very conflictual in that way. I think we've done very well in changing. Politics used to be about who had the most soldiers and who could kill the most people, and then they'd be in charge. We've done very well to turn down the heat and turn that into who has the most votes to be in charge. So I think we've made a lot of progress, and I think that we apply the same criteria to politicians if they're good leaders, if governments enforce contracts, if they protect property, if they redistribute things fairly, we think they're good. If they are incompetent, if they don't enforce the law, if they are kleptocratic, if they steal, we think they're bad. Certainly politics is strange. Politicians can be better or worse, but they've certainly been a lot worse in the past.
Thank you very much, Oliver. What an optimistic note to end on. So politics is far from perfect, but it's moving in the right direction. And we all need to keep it moving in the right direction. I'm now going to draw the Q&A to a close. That's been absolutely fantastic. Thank you for all your amazing questions. Thank you, Oliver, for that absolute masterclass in morality and the discussion as well. Now, I know that you've already got the Darwin Day medal because we've talked about this. And I hope that you've been very moral and kept it in its box and not even looked at it until this moment. So now I'd like to officially confer it on you and invite you to open the box. And could you show us the medal, please?
Okay, I will. Thank you very much for bestowing this enormous honor on me. Here we go. Are you ready? 1, 2, 3. Oh, look.
Ah, look at that. We're blinded by the light of Darwin, still shining down through the centuries on us. Congratulations, Oliver. Thank you for a wonderful Darwin Day lecture. Thank
you very much. And thank you for my beautiful medal.
Now, we can't hear the attendees clapping, but I know they are all clapping at home. So just quiet clap now. So thank you again for your lecture, taking us right up taking us from the origins of moral science with Darwin himself right up to contemporary philosophy, psychology and genetics. And I know that the audience would still be clapping if we could hear them. Thank you to everyone who's joined us tonight. I hope you've enjoyed the lecture as much as I have, but also you have helped support the important work of Humanists UK just by being here. And I've talked a little bit about that work that includes human rights issues here and around the world, work that includes making sure that non-religious people have a voice in a country where religious privilege is still so ingrained, even when less than half of our country is religious, and work that just generally promotes a scientific, rational approach to the challenges facing us today. And more people we know are discovering humanism every year, believing that the world is a natural place, that humans are biological phenomena, and that we have it within ourselves to live a good life, a life in which we create our own meaning. So it's not surprising that increasing numbers of people are choosing to mark their important life events in a humanist way, with humanist weddings, naming ceremonies and funerals. And another part of the work that Humanists UK does is supporting the training of humanist celebrants for those ceremonies. And our recently published, immensely successful Little Book of Humanism also supports that training too. But as I've said, your attendance here tonight helps as well. So thank you. Now, you might be interested in attending other events organised by Humanists UK. Our next public lecture is the Rosalind Franklin Lecture 2021, which is our lecture for International Women's Day. And it will be delivered by the vaccinologist, Professor Sarah Gilbert. She's the Oxford project leader on the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. And that will be chaired by Samira Ahmed on Friday, the 5th of March. Tickets are available right now on the website. Thank you again for being here tonight. Thank you, Andrew, Ian, Liam, everybody at Humanists UK HQ. Thank you again, Oliver. Good night, everybody. Stay safe. Keep well.